Hello, everyone. Welcome to another evening of linguistic meetings, which is the 95th. That's a lot. Welcome to İzmir Dilbilim Linguistic Circle. Tonight we have a great presentation as always, and we have a very special guest, Dr. Thomas McFadden. I'm going to briefly introduce you all who Thomas McFadden is, and then I will let him speak. Dr. Thomas McFadden, an accomplished linguist and and associate professor at Stony Brook University's Department of Linguistics, with a PhD in linguistics from the University of Pennsylvania. His research focuses on theoretical and comparative syntax and morphology, particularly the syntax-morphology interface. He has made significant contributions to historical linguistics, specializing in Germanic languages and Tamil, and has a strong background in computational linguistics, developing tools and methods for corpus-based studies. Thomas has an impressive academic career, previously holding positions at renowned institutions such as, the Leibniz Zentrum Allgemeine Sprachwissenschaft, not sure, sorry for my accent there, but in Berlin, and the University of Tromsø. He has also received prestigious grants and fellowships, including a Fulbright Fellowship and funding from groundbreaking projects in linguistics. His work has been widely published in leading journals, and he is a sought-after speaker at international conferences. Tonight, his presentation will be on phase theory. The title of the presentation is A Modular Reimplementation of Phase Theory. Please do join me in welcoming Thomas McFadden. Hello again, Thomas McFadden. Welcome to our evening. Seriously, it's a great pleasure to have you here, and we are all very excited to be listening to your presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the really kind introduction, and especially thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to get to speak with you, and thanks to everybody for showing up. As I mentioned in the sort of discussions there at the beginning, this is a topic that I've been working on off and on for quite a while, and I'm trying to sort of get it into shape for an actual publication. So I'll be very interested to hear your comments, your thoughts, your questions. I went to full screen. Did that work? Everybody can see the slides?
Yep.
Very good. Okay. All right. So I'm going to be talking today about phase theory, and what I'm going to be doing here is not really changing the basic idea of what phase theory wants to cover. So the empirical coverage here is going to be very, very similar to traditional phase theory. I'm going to change the way, try to argue for a different way to implement it in a way that I think is useful and makes phase theory kind of make more sense. Excuse me, if we compare it to other cognitive and design principles. So the starting point here for phase theory originally was that there's this observation that we've been making, people have made over and over again in the last several decades looking at syntax. It's this basic idea of locality, that syntactic operations and relationships have to apply within a local domain. The two things that are dependent on each other or interact in some way have to be close to each other in some sense. But that this locality is attenuated by what we sometimes call successive cyclicity. So you can put together what look like non-local relationships by taking a series of individually local relationships and chaining them together. You can't do this any way you want, right? So this doesn't completely circumvent locality. It's very restricted how you can do it, but it is a way to create what are sometimes called unbounded dependencies, where, for example, it looks like you can move a WH movement, an element up through as many matrix clauses as you like. So this is something that we've kind of known for a long time, and there have been lots of different ways to explain this or implement this in theoretical terms. The way that it's usually done in current minimalism is in terms of the idea of phases. And I should say here, like, as you can see from the citations, the idea of phases has been around for a long time. This is not a new idea. And there's a ton of work in the intervening period, especially in the last 10 years or so, that is sort of pulling phase theory apart this way or that and coming up with different ways to do things and replacing parts of it. All of which I think is very interesting. I'd like what I'm doing here to be understood also in that tradition. Phase theory gets at the basic ideas reasonably well, but it doesn't do it in a particularly good way. It's ugly in a lot of ways, and we'd like to find something to replace it that gets better, gets closer to the data, and also gets closer to what's going on conceptually. This is one way to think about doing that. I think some of the other ideas out there, like thinking in terms of horizons for probes, or thinking in terms of intervention effects instead of domain effects. I think that those are very promising, and those might be the right way to go. This is a different way to think about it. But the basic idea that of what phase theory does is that it says that syntactic derivations proceed in terms of phases, and what's these domains that are called phases, and what's inside of a phase is essentially invisible to what's inside of another phase. So in principle, things in two phases can't interact with each other. But there's this exception that the upper part, what we call the edge of a phase, is transparent to the next phase up. So there's this one small portion of two phases basically that is shared, that can interact with each other. And that edge is used as an escape hatch. So if something is in a lower phase and it wants to get in and interact with something in a higher phase, that can only happen if it first goes into this escape hatch at the edge. And that's the tool that's used for getting at the successive cyclicity part. So basically what we have here are what we can think of as opaque domains that have escape hatches. So in principle, like by default, phases are opaque, they can't interact with each other, but there's one little way to get out that certain things can use. Right? And that basic idea even predates phase theory. That was there in earlier in different kinds of locality theories that were around in the government binding era, like barriers, for example. The implementation was different, but that basic idea was the same. What phase theory does that's different from anything that came before is that it tries to not just stipulate we've got these domains that are closed off from each other, not just say there's a barrier somewhere that blocks things, but instead have this come out of the way that the derivation is built up. So there's this step-by-step derivation that builds structure up, but every once in a while, that derivation stops, takes a chunk of the structure and transfers it or spells it out, sends it off to the interfaces. And the idea is that transfer operation, one way or another, it's not always clear exactly how this is supposed to work, but one way or another, that makes the structure that's been spelled out opaque to later stages of the derivation, right? So that's how that phases are opaque, because they get spelled out periodically. And once something is spelled out, it can't interact at all, or it can't interact in a normal way with things that come later, right? And this is embodied in what's called the phase impenetrability condition, right? That just says the stuff in a lower phase, once it's been spelled out, is no longer accessible to things in higher phases, right? The way that you get the successive cyclicity bit, the little bit of transparency at the edges, is that when you're building up the structure, you only transfer a lower amount. Some bit at the top sticks around for a while in order to interact with later stages of the derivation. That gives us the escape hatch. Now, I want to rethink this based on an observation about what this kind of sounds like, right? So if you think about what phases are supposed to do, they sound a lot like modules. And we're used to talking about modules in linguistics often when we think about, syntax versus phonology versus semantics, maybe having a modular design. Back in government binding era, we talked about the syntax was built up of several different modules like case theory and theta theory and binding theory, right? Each of those had its own little sets of principles, and then the entire system was built up by putting them together. But that way of doing modularity hasn't been popular for quite a while. And I think it should be. And I think because phases, if you think about them carefully, they really sound like modules. Because in a modular system, the whole point of a modular system, not just in linguistics, but everywhere in how cars are designed, how computers are designed, how any sort of complicated system is designed. The idea of a module is you break down the big complex structure into smaller, simpler pieces. Each of those pieces works on its own principles, gets put together in some way, and then you have a simple set of rules for putting those things together so they can interact with each other using sort of standardized interfaces, but they can't screw around with the inside parts of each other. So 3 is a definition that applies, I think, equally well to the idea of phases and to the idea of modules. So a phase or a module is a unit that combines, these are units that combine together within larger structures. They're characterized by opaque domains. So inside, they can't see the insides of each other, but they allow for interactions, heavily constrained interactions, but interactions with each other via transparent edges. Right. And this is again, this is not an idea from linguistics. Early structural linguistics played an important role in coming up with these ideas at the theoretical level. But this is an idea that goes to the design of actual physical systems. The whole point is, again, is to break things down into simple pieces that each have kind of one job to do. And crucially, you want those pieces to each be able to do their job without worrying about the other things. You don't want them to have to worry about something else getting in the way. So you break it down into these simple objects, but then since you're trying to build a complex system, you need a way to put those objects together and for them to talk to each other, to interact just enough so that they can cooperate, but you don't want them to interact so much that they get in each other's way, right? So there's this idea of encapsulation. The concerns of an individual module are encapsulated. The internals, the way that the inside of your one module works, is not visible to another module, so they can't get in each other's way. But you have a little bridge, a little way for them to connect up to each other, and that's how they can pass information back and forth and do something together. One sort of simple example of this would be the USB system that we use for our computer, all sorts of electronic devices, right? If you have a phone that takes a USB-C charger, you can buy any USB-C cable basically anywhere and plug it into your phone, and you can be pretty sure that you'll be able to charge your phone with it. And that cable was not built with your specific phone in mind. It has no idea how the internal parts of your phone work. It just knows I need to have a plug that's shaped like this, and I need to send power this way, and I maybe need to send data this way. And I need to know how to deal with power and data. But what the phone does with that power and data is none of my business. I don't care. I don't know anything about it. And that's why you can buy and connect together several different devices that will work together. And with using USB, because it does data and power, you can use this for charging phones, but you can also use it for plugging a printer into your laptop, or use it for having communication between like a remote control and your iPad if you're trying to do slides and that sort of thing, right? That's a modular system. And that's what phases look like. But that's not really how phase theory works. Phase theory makes phases feel like modules, but it doesn't implement them in a serious way as modules, right? So with modular design, with modularity, with this principle, the whole goal of it, when people do this intentionally, when they when they design a system to be modular, the whole goal is to make it so that you can combine together individual modules in a way that makes sense and reuse them. And you can put them together in ways that maybe you hadn't anticipated before, right? So it's all about having things that work on that each do their own job, and you can put them together arbitrarily, right? So you want to set things up to make that as easy as possible. And that's what the interfaces do for you. The interface, so with USB, the interface is the USB interface. It's the shape of the plugs, and it's the mapping of what part of the plug sends power and what part sends data, etc. Right? It's a standard thing that all of them have in common, but the internal workings of your phone, of your computer, of your printer, they don't care. They are completely separate, and they have nothing to do with each other, right? Okay, so if that's the way that modularity works, and if we think that phases feel kind of like modules, because they do, then we shouldn't be we shouldn't be building up phases in the way that we construct phases. Shouldn't be you build up a big structure and then you rip out a piece and call that a phase, call that a module, right? We shouldn't be building up a unified structure, pulling out parts of it, right, by transfer, and getting sort of modularity through the back door in that way. Instead, right, the way that modules normally work is you build the modules independent of each other, and then you plug them in, right? You build your phone, you build your USB cable, you build your printer, and then at some point you plug them all in together with each other, and they're able to talk in the final unified complex system through the interfaces, but you built them separately. And so what I'm proposing with this idea that I call phase stitching is that we do the same thing with phases. So the basic idea here, and I should pause for 1 second on terminology. I use the term workspace here, and I maybe should stop doing that because everybody, especially recently, a lot of the recent work by Chomsky and together with Bob Berwick and Mathilde Marcoli and Rini Halbrechts and others, they've been talking about workspaces a lot, and it's a related idea to what I'm talking about here, but it's a very different idea. The details are very, very different. For the rest of this talk, when I say workspace, do not think about a Chomsky style workspace because these are different, and the properties of the workspace here matter. It's a term that I chose a long time ago, and maybe I should switch it out, but for now, don't get confused by it. So the idea is this. Phases are created independently of each other. So it's not like you build up the little VP phase and then you add on you build the CP phase on top of it in one big structure, and at some point rip out the little VP phase. No, you build up the little VP phase by itself. You build up the CP phase by itself, and then you put them together. Right? So where you build up a phase, that's what I call a workspace. So the workspaces are places where things get where phases get built. And something that will be important later is that you are only allowed to use a workspace for one piece of structure at a time. This is where it's different from other people's ideas of workspaces. So you got one workspace per phase, and once the phases are completed, you can put them together in an operation that I call stitching. I'll explain stitching in great detail later. And I have this other term to make it clear. Putting together phases, stitching together phases is a different operation than the operation that you use to build the phases in the first place. So phases are built up by merge, just like in anybody else's story. But taking two phases and combining them by stitching, this operation stitching is not merge. It has different properties. And so just to make things clear, that doesn't happen in a workspace because it's a different operation. That happens in to build up your individual phases. And then at the end, you put them all together in one assembly area to create the final structure. Now, crucial thing about workspaces, this is, as I said, this is where merge happens, right? This is also where agree happens. This is where everything happens that is sensitive to locality. Every syntactic operation that cares about locality has to happen inside of a single workspace before phases get stitched together. So everything you want to do that's local has to happen within a single phase. That's what gives us basic opacity of phases. You can't have any merge operations involving two different phases with each other. They're encapsulated from each other because they're not together. The bit of transparency that we need to get long distance dependencies, to get successive cyclicity, that comes from the stitching operation, where what stitching does, instead of taking I'm gesturing, but I realize you probably can't see me, right? You can't actually see me, right? Then I'll stop gesturing. Okay. Um,
No, we can see you. You
oh,
can continue as you wish.
you can see me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay. So whereas merge takes two things and puts them together without mucking about inside, stitching takes two things and combines them so that they have a shared edge. That's why it's called stitching. If you think about, like, if you're sewing two things together, when you sew together two pieces of fabric, their edges have to overlap, right? So that there's something for the thread to go through, right? And so the stitching operation is like that. You take two phases and you combine them at a shared interface, at a shared edge, and that edge then becomes common between them. And that's the place, it's just like when you plug in a USB cable into a device, that's the place where all of the information can travel back and forth. That's how you get anything that's not a local relationship. So now I have very low-grade animations to show you this idea. So here we have two separate phases. They're each in their own workspace. The workspaces are sort of suggested by those boxes surrounding them. They don't know anything about each other. They have been built up by merge completely independently, and so they can't talk to each other at this stage. They can't, their merges and their agrees can't do anything together because they're not in the same place. They're not, you can imagine, like, they could be on opposite sides of the world and know nothing about each other. But then you look at them and you see, aha, they've got parts of the structure that actually match. So the CDE at the bottom of the left-hand structure matches the CDE at the top of the right-hand structure. They have matching edges, and that means that I can now stitch them together. And the result is a single structure that has a single instance of the CDE edge, right? So here we had two distinct CDEs, right? They're not the same structure. Stitching makes them into one unified single structure, right? So now they share their edges, not because that edge was built together, but because the edges were built separately and then stitched. Okay, this is how things are going to be able to talk to each other across phases. But if you notice, everything else is still completely opaque. AB and FG, they were built separately and they have not been stitched together. So they still know absolutely nothing about each other and cannot interact. So what this will do is this will get us, empirically, this should get us more or less exactly the same combination of opacity and transparency, so locality, but with some exceptions that we have in standard phase theory. So that operation is called phase stitching or just stitching. And I think I've already sort of mentioned this, but I'll just say it again quickly. The operations that we're familiar with, merge and agree, and everything that cares about locality, that has to happen within individual workspaces. They're only defined to apply within workspaces. And the final part of the derivation is all about stitching multiple stages together in the assembly area. And one thing that I didn't say, I think, stitching does not cause any modifications, and it doesn't involve any loss of information. So the CDE are both there. Both of them are still there, and they have not been changed, right? Nothing about the structure has been changed. Nothing is modified. They get unified, but not modified, and that's important. That means that that heavily restricts, like, what you can do at this point. Okay. Okay, a couple of important things about the workspaces, and this is where these details, this is where my workspaces differ from other people's workspaces. So each phase is built in its own workspace, and in a sense, what is a phase is defined by what you happen to build up in a single workspace. That is what phases are. So in standard phase theory, what's a phase is kind of defined by where you trigger spell out or transfer. Here it's defined by what you build up in an individual workspace. And again, the workspaces cannot talk to each other. They're completely encapsulated from each other. Again, agree and merge have to happen internal to workspaces. That includes move, of course. This is a really important point. The fourth bullet point here. Each workspace contains at all times a single uniquely rooted structure. That's going to be important for certain things going forward. And this is, again, a very, very different from what other people say. So you cannot have two separate trees inside a single workspace that then merge together. All you can have is something, you merge something with it, you merge something with that, you merge something with that. You can't have merge these two over here, merge these two over here, and then merge the results together. That is not allowed within a workspace. That'll be important for how certain locality things come out of this. Right. That means that you can't do anything like sideward movement, because sideward movement relies on having two separate trees and merging part of one of the trees with the other tree. So that's not possible. You also cannot have two internally complex branches as sisters. So you can't have two things that are sisters of each other where both of them have daughters. Because the only way to get that by binary merge is to merge two things over here, and then merge two things over here, and then merge the results together. And that's precisely what you're not allowed to do within a workspace. So the only way that you can get, I mean, effectively, this means you can't have complex specifiers, you can't have complex adjuncts. You can have you can have a head, basically, as a specifier or adjunct, but there can't be any internal structure. And right. The only way to get that, the only way to get complex specifiers is by, there's two ways to do it. One is internal merge. So you can create a complex structure in the complement position and then move that up to merge with the entire structure. That will give you a complex specifier. Or by stitching. The main way to get complex extra structure is by building the structure separately in separate phases in separate workspaces and then stitching them together. So the main way that you're going to get interesting stuff going on with specifiers is via stitching. Now, this last part is, all of this together gets us the part of the phase impenetrability condition that says that things in separate phases can't talk to each other, right? The dependencies involved in merge and agree and move, they have to apply within a single workspace. So that means that a dependency involving things in two different phases, you just can't state it. There's no way to talk about that. The way that we get the little bit of transparency is via the interfaces. So, and the interfaces here are the edges, right? And this is where stitching comes in. So the job, the job of the edge, basically, is to of any phase is basically to lay out like what are the things that I can combine with, what are the things that I can communicate with. That's very much like the USB system. Your computer, your phone, if it has a USB port, the USB port is a way for your computer to say, I can interact with things that use this system. This is the kind of information and the kind of power that I can play with, that I can share with or get from something on the outside. And it's the same thing with phases. The syntactic material you have in your edge that tells us something about the kinds of other phases that you can stitch with, because stitching requires a kind of matching. Now, the way that stitch works, sort of in the deeper level details, and I won't go into this in much detail here, but the basic idea here is an operation called unification, which some of you may be familiar with, depending on what other. So unification doesn't usually play a role in minimalism, but it's the fundamental operation in LFG and HPSG and a lot of other theories of grammar. What unification does is basically if you have two things that have features, unification. So like, let's say you have for example, if you have a subject that comes with a certain number of 5 features and a verb that comes with a different set of 5 features, you can do this unification operation where the resulting structure will have all of the 5 features from both sides, as long as none of them contradict each other. So if the subject is, say, like first person singular, and the verb says first person feminine, right? Those two can get together as first person singular feminine. But if you have first person singular and third person feminine, well, first and third person conflict, and so you can't get unification there. So what unification does is basically you take two things, you collect together all of the information from both of them, and the result has all of that together as long as there's no contradictions. Once you have a contradiction, the whole thing fails. Okay. Stitch is like that. If you have two phases with edges that fit together in some way, they share some information together. They may not share all of the information, that one might have a bit more information, some more features than the other. But as long as there's no contradictions, they can combine together, right? And in order for things to work well, I have to hypothesize, postulate that Stitch is not allowed to make any modifications. All it can do is combine these things together. So unification just collects things together. It doesn't change anything, right? The only sort of kind of thing that looks a bit like a change is that it can add information from one side that isn't there on the other. But that's not a change, right? Because the other side had nothing there. So it can't delete features. It can't change a value from singular to plural. None of that is possible. So here's a semi-formalized definition of Stitch. Stitch applies to two phases, x and y, where the edge at the root of x matches an edge interior to y, yielding an output where those edges become a single unified structure. Okay. And again, I think this needs to be formalized. This is, like I said, this is sort of semi-formalized. If we want to formalize it completely, we probably want to use unification, but that goes further than I want to get into here. So if we look at some examples, if we have the structures in A and B, they can stitch the part in 5A that's XAB that matches with that's an external edge. That's an edge at the root of this structure. This is an internal edge that matches. So they can stitch together and give us the more complex structure in C, where now we have a single instance of XAB that's kind of bridging between what used to be X and what used to be Y. But if you look at these two structures, there's no way for them to stitch together because they don't have matching edges. So like you have an almost matching edge. So the external edge at the root of 6A, X with daughters A and B. If you look at the tree in B, we have an internal edge with X dominating A, but not dominating B, and in fact, it dominates E, right? So E and B, that's a contradiction. They do not match with each other, and given binary branching, there's no, like, so you could maybe unify these so that you have X with 3 daughters, but since this system is purely binary branching, that is ruled out, right? So these two structures don't completely match. They have a mismatch, so stitching is not possible here. So there's no way to put those together. So let's look at some actual linguistic examples, very, very simple examples, but just to get the idea of how this would work. If you could build up in 7A, we're building up, this is basically the CP phase. You build up a structure that's got, starts with little v, has the external argument Svetlana, then has a T, and then up in TP, Svetlana internally, it does internal merge and moves up to spec TP. And then we can build up the little VP phase where we've got the verb plays and its complement chess. We've got little v, and we've got Svetlana introduced as the external argument there as well. We have matching internal and external edges, little VP Svetlana dominating Svetlana and little VP dominating Svetlana and little v. They can stitch together and give us this complete structure. Svetlana plays chess, right? And let me just say I'll just point out one thing here before I go to the next slide. In these two structures, we have two different Svetlanas. And when these phases are built, those are two different Svetlanas. They have nothing to do with each other, right? This Svetlana over here, who knows what it's doing, but it doesn't have any thematic status, right? But okay, it's here in the spec of little v, and it moves up to spec TP. Great, fine. Over here, we've got Svetlana merging also in a spec little v, and it can get some sort of semantic relationship with playing chess, right? But these are two different things. At the moment you stitch them together, though, they become one single Svetlana. The two Svetlanas become one Svetlana, and now the Svetlana that's up here, right, is now indirectly related to plays chess via the lower Svetlana that came from the lower phase. So what this gives us, first of all, we've got a simple way to describe the dependencies between phases, right? That's the matching requirement. You can't just put any old phases together with each other. The matching requirement makes sure that you do things like respect C selection and that sort of thing, right? So, but also that you have, right, so this is gonna make sure that you have a C phase and a little V phase getting together in the right order, not some other random thing, because the lower part of the C phase will include a little V, and the upper part of the little V phase will also include a little V. They'll have matching things that can stitch. But you can also do more interesting things like making sure that the little VP phase that's got try is only going to combine together with a lower phase that corresponds to a control infinitive, right? So simple sort of C selection stuff can be carried over here across phases because you can only put phases together that match. We'll see in a second also that this is going to help us deal with movement, right? If you've got movement across multiple phases, you want to make sure that you get phases together that all involve the relevant intermediate steps of movement. Right. And then the second thing that we get here is the escape hatch, right? In order for stitch to work, the two phases getting together have to both contain the copy of the edge stuff that they share, right? And that means, as we already saw with Svetlana, whatever's in the edge is going to be able to participate in local relationships in both the upstairs phase and the downstairs phase, because it originally came from both phases and then gets unified. Right. So that's why Svetlana gets to do, let's say, maybe case and agreement in the upstairs phase, but theta stuff in the downstairs phase. Because there were two separate Svetlanas, each doing their own job. They come together and it turns out, it was one Svetlana all along. Right. So here's some structures for getting a simple example of successive cyclic WH movement. And I tried to squeeze it all into one slide, so it's a little bit. Hopefully, it's clear that this thing down here is a separate tree, right? So, the tree on the left, all the way to the left, this is the CP phase, right? So it starts off at the bottom, right, with little v. It has to include everything down to the edge of the next phase down. So we've got John. And that's the external argument. We have this random what floating around. Who knows what it's doing here, right? We're going to find out. But as far as this phase is concerned, there's just a what, right? In spec little VP. We've got an auxiliary verb in T. We've got a second copy of John, right? They've got the same index because John moves from spec little VP up to spec TP for whatever it is that causes subject movement in English. The auxiliary do moves from T to C because English has T to C movement in this kind of clause, what's going to be a WH clause. And we have a second copy of what up here in spec CP. So there's this weird what that comes out of nowhere in spec little VP, and there's another copy of it in spec CP. So this is the upstairs clause, the upstairs phase of a WH movement example. Now here's the downstairs phase where some things make a little bit more sense. We have a copy of a what, which is the thematic object of say. It's the complement of say. We have little v, and we have a John merged here as the specifier of little v. That's going to be the thematic subject, the agent, if you will, of say. We have another copy of what in an outer specifier of little vp. We can talk in a little bit about what triggers WH movement, but something is triggering WH movement here. And within this phase, it just makes it move to the edge of the phase up to spec little VP. Right? And now what happens is these two phases can stitch because they have matching edges, little VP dominating what and little v, which dominates John and little VP dominating what and little v, which dominates John and little v. Those match. So we can stitch them together and we get this resulting structure where now a whole bunch of stuff has been unified and a lot of stuff makes sense that didn't make sense before. So what started out as sort of two copies of one instance of John and a completely separate instance of John, now they're just two copies of a single instance of John, who gets a theta roll down here and then participates in case and agreement up here. But more interestingly, we get what used to be four different copies of two different instances of what are now three copies of one instance of what. There's a what down here, which is unified, which is related by movement to this what here, which is unified with a different what, which is then related by movement to this. But so it's all one what. Even though we had two instances of movement and each of those instances of movement were internal to a single phase, the result is long distance movement. It's still successive cyclic, but it can cover an unbounded different distance. Okay. And so we get what did John say, basically. Once we delete lower copies of everything, we get what did John say, and everything works out fine. So we see here how like the stitching lets us get together individual local dependencies to chain them together to create one big long distance dependency. Okay. So that's the basic idea. And now I'm gonna, in the time that I have left, I don't have a ton of time, but in the time that I have left, I'm gonna go through a couple of effects of this and see a few more examples. I'll sort of pick and choose which ones I really want to talk about. And feel free to ask me about other things in the question period. So the first thing, this comes out really straightforwardly from the way that I restricted individual workspaces to only having one rooted structure. This is what's sometimes called the condition on extraction domains, or CED. This is a kind of locality effect that phase theory kind of sort of can deal with, but only kind of sort of, right? Which is the basic idea here is like you can move things out of complements, but not out of specifiers or adjuncts. To a surprising extent, adjuncts and specifiers are islands for extraction. Now, I will say right here, the CED is not as strong as it sometimes is made out to be. Especially specifiers are not always as opaque as the CED would lead us to expect. Extraction out of adjuncts is usually not possible, but there are some specifiers that let you extract out of them. And that's actually a bit of a problem for the story here because I derive a super strong form of the CED. Just a couple of examples just so that you guys are familiar with what I'm talking about. So you can extract easily from a complement. Rhonda likes drinking water. You can extract the water. That's the complement of drinking. What does Rhonda like drinking? But extracting from a specifier doesn't work so well. So if you start from drinking water makes Rhonda thirsty, drinking water is a specifier here. What does drinking make Rhonda thirsty is very bad. Another extraction from a complement. Gary shouted that Mary brought beer. That Mary brought beer is a complement clause, and we can easily extract from there. What did Gary shout that Mary brought? That's fine. Long distance movement there is fine. But if we make the embedded clause here an adjunct instead of a complement, Gary shouted because Mary brought beer. And we try to extract now, what did Gary shout because Mary brought, or what did shout because Mary brought? That's really quite bad, right? So you can extract from complements, but not so much from specifiers and adjuncts. This is my caveat that I already mentioned, that the data here are actually a lot more interesting than I'm pretending that they are, especially with specifiers. There are lots of cases where it looks like you actually can extract out of specifiers. But let me give you the quick rundown on how phase stitching gets us this. Remember there's this requirement that you can only have a single rooted structure in an individual workspace. That means that complex specifiers pretty much always have to be, and adjuncts have to be phases, right? Because they are complex branches that are not complements. That means the only way to get them is to build them in their own workspace, and so they must be phases. And that's going to make them opaque. And I think for reasons of time, I won't go through the demonstration, but like that kind of just comes out of the approach. Anything that's a phase, you're not going to be able to extract out of unless there's a way to look at the edge. Actually, maybe I will show you that bit of the structure. Hold on a second. Let me. Okay. I'm skipping ahead here to see which part I can show. Yeah, I don't think there's a simple way to do this, but let me just show you. If we have extraction from a complement, we're going to end up with a structure like this, which this is the structure for the upstairs phase. Oh, sorry, this is the structure for the downstairs phase, right? Where we've got what that Mary brought. That's the intermediate structure here. And the upstairs phase is going to be what did Gary shout? And the thing to notice is in the upstairs the higher clause, so that we're trying to build what did Gary shout that Mary brought, right? And in the upstairs phase, we've got a copy of what down in the specifier of CP, which can move up to the specifier of CP in the up at the top. In the downstairs phase, we also have a copy of what down at the bottom and another one up at the top with movement. And so these two could stitch together. And I don't have the, okay. Anyway, somehow I left off that structure. You stitch this together with this, and you're going to get a big tree for what did Gary shout that Mary brought. And the reason why it's going to work is because this copy of what down here will unify with this copy of what up here, and we'll have a single what that at the end that has started all the way at the bottom and moved up. With adjuncts, that's not going to be possible because you won't be able to see into the edge of the phase in order to grab a copy and move it up. I'm happy to talk about that more in the question period. I know that I made that really sort of complicated. Here's what the adjunct will look like. So here's the so this is you're trying to build what did drinking make Rhonda thirsty? So the question from drinking water made Rhonda thirsty, right? So the embedded clause is drinking what, starts out as drinking what, you move the what up to the specifier, that's fine. What does something something make Rhonda thirsty? We're going to put the CP in here for drinking water, right? We've got we could put a copy of what up here in spec CP in the upstairs clause. When we stitch, so we've got a CP here, we've got a CP here. Those are matching edges. They can stitch. So we can absolutely build this structure, right? Where we've got this CP as the subject of this clause, right? And we've got what drinking, and we've got a what up here. The problem is this what and this what have nothing to do with each other because what stitched was the CP, just the CP. The edge was just the CP. So now the CP here and the CP here are the same CP node, but this upstairs clause knows nothing about the internal structure of this CP. It can't see the copies of what. It has no idea that there's a what here. So the stitching has not unified this what with this what. Oops, with this what. So that's why they still have different indices. This is what A and this is what 1. They have nothing to do with each other. So this will give us a sentence like, what does what drinking make Rhonda thirsty? Which is, first of all, that's not the structure we were looking for because we haven't actually succeeded in moving this what out. But second of all, it's also ungrammatical because from anywhere, it never got a theta roll, right? So we can't actually do the movement out of the specifier because the stitching operation cannot see the internal structure of that and cannot unify this element that's trying to move with this element that's also trying to move. Right? So that's the basic thing that's going to come out of there, right? And with adjunct, it's going to be basically the same thing. We'll have a similar structure, and you can stitch adjuncts into bigger clauses. The stitching is not where the problem is. It's that the stitching won't be able to see the internal structure of the one thing that gets stitched, and so nothing on the inside is going to be able to communicate with what's on the outside. So this is why adjuncts absolutely can move, You can move adjuncts, you can move specifiers, because here again, like you can, this upstairs clause can see the CP. So if this CP is what moved up here, that would be fine. But you can't see what's inside the CP, and so you can't extract anything out of it. Okay, let me do, I think I'm basically out of time. So let me quickly just mention the three other things that I have here, and then I'll leave that for the discussion period. So the three other things that are interesting here, one is that if you do phase theory this way, there's a way to have your overall derivation be bottom up, but also left to right. So you can, because the order in which phases are built is completely independent of each other. Each phase, so in traditional phase theory, you start at the bottom and you build the entire sentence from bottom to top. And that makes things a little bit awkward for processing and production, because processing and production clearly work at least a little bit left to right. And, you know, that's not the end of the world, but it's something that people sometimes get a little bit worried about. With phase stitching, because the phases are really built completely independent of each other, the stitching operation is set up in such a way that the order that you stitch things in doesn't actually matter either. You have to stitch things in the right place, but you can build this phase and then build this phase and then build this phase and stitch them in that order, and everything will work out just fine. So you can actually, inside of an individual phase, everything is bottom up. But the way that you put phases together could absolutely be done left to right. So you can maybe a little bit more easily map this theory onto this theory of the structures, of the abstract structures, onto a theory of production and perception and processing. The second thing about specify is a little bit more about specifiers and movement. And so there is a bit about the way that we do stitching. I said you need to do stitching for every specifier, except for specifiers that are created by movement. That gives us a little bit of flexibility. If we combine that with unification, there's some flexibility for having certain specifiers be very simple in one phase, but very complicated in another phase. They can, as long as they're consistent with each other, they can stitch together. This gives us a way, I think, to get at things like reconstruction, where the two different readings that are possible, or in general ambiguity of scope, where you can have optionality in when you put a structure together, is the full complex structure of a specifier in its higher position or in its lower position. If the quantifier then semantically is only in the lower position, then you can get these distinct scope interpretation effects. And then there's a bit here about intermediate movement, which is tricky for successive cyclic movement. If WH movement is triggered by the needs of a C, for example, by the needs of a landing site, it's a little bit, it's always been a bit mysterious why things have to start moving into the edge of a lower phase. We know that if they don't, they will never be able to get up to the top, but that doesn't mean that explains the requirements on the lower phase. I think phase stitching gives us a slightly better way to look at that. It's not a slam dunk, but it is a little bit better. That you can do the equivalent of an over-generate and filter approach, where basically you build up all the possible imaginable phases and make them available, and then you grab the one that you need at the time. If you've started with an upstairs phase that wants long distance movement, it will only be able to stitch together with a lower phase that has already undergone movement. So you can do over-generate and filter without having to over-generate very much. Right? Okay, I will stop at that point, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. That was a great presentation, seriously. Very detailed, very interesting. And now let's get to the question section. Who has questions? Or should we ask Murat to have a very nice
It's very
question? I'm
obvious
sure
that you've
he's
been working
eager
on
there
this
to
for
ask
for 10 years.
questions. So yes,
Because it's not short.
yes.
Yeah, it's too much. It's too much.
Yeah. I can ask a question if
Yes,
no
please.
one else is willing to. So in the literature, there is something called assembly problem. Have you ever heard of this? It was in Dobashi's work where he was talking about prosodic phrasing.
Uh-huh.
So he was, yeah. So he was talking about cases where the spell out domains. So how do we know that spell out domains are chained to each other at PF level? Because they are like separate domains. So
Yeah.
yeah. So he proposes a way where PF, well, he proposes an algorithm which he thinks PF uses so that PF can chain one spell out domain to another. And he says that the first item in the spell out domain escapes to join the next spell out domain so that workspace 1 can chain to workspace 2.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think your theory is somehow similar to that one. But I would like to know the difference, the significant difference between your theory from that one.
Okay. So I have to say that I'm not familiar with that theory specifically, but I think I understand the idea. And when I first started working on this in some of my earliest presentations on this, I made a bit of a bigger deal about this issue of in the way if you depending on how you understand standard phase theory, it sounds like you're building up the structure and then you rip it apart and you send the pieces off to the interfaces, and then what happens? There seems to be this obvious problem of like at the end you want one single structure for interpretation and for pronunciation. You need to be able to build prosodic domains that cross over between phases. And it sounds like so in traditional phase theory, it kind of sounds like you pull things apart so that the syntax doesn't cause any problems. But then later at the interfaces, you have to put them back together. Is that right? Is that what Dobashi is trying to deal with? Like you've got separate spell out domains at PF, but actually you need to pronounce them as a single string,
Yeah,
and you need prosody to be able to operate across them. So you need an operation that puts them back together, right? So you got this
that's what he
problem.
was talking about. Yeah.
That's the assembly problem, right? So
Mhm.
yeah, so part of the inspiration of this approach is to you just avoid that entirely. There is no assembly, like that seems like that's part of why phase theory seems like the wrong way to do things, because we're trying to build a big structure. We're not trying to build a structure and then periodically rip it apart, because then you have to put it all back together again. That seems like a duplication of effort. So part of the motivation of the story was like, no, we'll the things that shouldn't interact with each other, they should be done separately. But then at the end, we want to put it all together to make one big structure for PF and LF. And so that's the idea of like we build phases and put them together rather than we build one thing and then rip out the phases, because now the end result of this is one unified structure that PF and LF can work with. You don't need an algorithm for it then. Or rather, Stitch is the algorithm. But that algorithm is necessary not just for the interfaces, but also for the syntax, because you do want you want phases to talk to each other in a limited way at all for syntax and PF and LF. And this makes there be one operation that does that. So that would be the difference here. Um, I don't talk about that as much anymore because I realized if you read some of the early phase stuff carefully, I always assumed that the transfer and spell out had this very sort of earth-shattering, like they really pull things out and make them invisible. But it's sort of clear from some of the comments that people make, Chomsky makes sometimes, like that's not exactly what was intended. You don't actually rip the stuff out of the structure. You make it somehow less accessible. But if you go that way, I mean, if you like the strongest version of this maybe doesn't of this criticism doesn't necessarily go through. You still have one structure. It's just that parts of it are sort of turned off. My problem with that version of it is that, well, then why is there a PIC? Like the PIC seemed like a nice idea because if you rip it out of the structure, then of course they can't talk to each other anymore. They can't see each other. Um, but the way that transfer is actually apparently supposed to work is you don't take it away, you just pretend that you can't see it anymore, and that feels less interesting to me, right? So this is the story where no, they can't interact because they're just not in the same place yet, right?
Okay. This is an interesting work. I mean, so as far as I can see, you have implications with respect to CED effects and argument and adjunct asymmetries, right?
Yep.
So what else can you say about, I mean, so what other implications can your theory say with respect to UG?
So for the most part, again, like the most of the basics of locality come out the same. It's set up so that it'll mostly come out the same as in phase theory, as in standard phase theory. One sort of potential difference is like this might have implications for how we define. What's the right way to say this? So I said before, like the way phases are defined is different, because it's the amount of structure that you build up in a separate workspace before putting it together, rather than the amount of structure that you ship off to spell out. But how do you decide when you're done building a phase? Like that question is still there for both theories. And in standard phase theory, there's just this idea that there's a couple of heads that have a special status. Once you reach that head, that's a trigger to spell out. So little v, maybe transitive little v, C, maybe P, maybe D, whatever people argue, but certain heads have a special status as like the thing that triggers spell out. It's not obvious in my theory in phase stitching like that it has to be exactly like that. You could do it that way, where you say, all right, within a workspace, you build up until you hit one of the heads that's on this list. But there's, I think, a bit more flexibility. One possibility that I kind of like is instead of that, there's this idea that each of these workspaces is going to be an extended projection. So you need a theory of extended projection then, but basically within a workspace, you're building up a single extended projection, and that's what helps tell you when to stop. And that has a bit of an advantage of flexibility, like not all clauses are CPs. Some of them are a bit smaller. Not all nominal extended projections, maybe they don't all go up to the DP level. Maybe some of them go higher, they go up to PP, or they go up to a case phrase or something like that. And this makes it a little bit easier to put in the flexibility. A lot of people have had this in different specific versions of phase theory where the phase is not necessarily little VP or CP. It's the top. It's whatever the top level that you get to in building your clause before combining it with something else, right? There's work by I think Boblick and Wurmbrandt goes along those lines. So you have this bit of flexibility in what counts as a phase. That's harder to state if you're defining phases in terms of specific heads, but if the phase is defined in terms of whatever height you build up to in a particular structure before stitching it with something else, then that's there. That's one potential difference. And yeah, and like I said, the other thing, there's one thing that I didn't talk about. There's maybe something we can say about idiomatic and lexical things. So if building up a phase is something that's done in one area of grammar, and then putting the phases together is done in a different area of grammar by different principle, it makes it a little bit easier to imagine that some of this stuff gets stored in not exactly the lexicon, but some version of a lexicon. So you could imagine that like the basic so one obvious one, like if your transitive little VP phase always looks exactly the same, you can just build it once and store it, and you don't have to actually build that again every time you do it, because the differences between two different transitive little VP phases will be like the identity of the verbal root and the specific DPs that you plug in. But those could all be built separately in their own workspaces, and so you could have like the basic tree is something you build up once and you just save it. You don't have to redo it every time. Okay, that's not that exciting. What's more interesting is, what if we could do the same thing to store up idiomatic chunks, right? So this is something that nanosyntax does a lot, right? Nanosyntax has a lot of these ideas where like nanosyntax is always building lots and lots and lots of little tiny structures, which sounds like a lot of work, but some of them you actually want to store and not have to rebuild them individually every time. So lexical items, typical lexical items in nanosyntax, because you're spelling out an entire tree, what you're storing is an association of, let's say, phonology and semantics with a tree structure. My version here of phase stitching can do something like that, right? Where what you build up in a workspace could actually be, you could build up the syntax in the workspace. You can already do some of the interface work, figure out the basics of the phonology and the semantics, and you could just store that. You could memorize that. And that's what you could do for an idiomatic expression. That's what you could do for the kinds of things that people like to say are construction effects, right? So you can pick off some of the things that people give as arguments for, say, construction grammar, but actually implement them in this theory, which is absolutely not construction grammar at all. But it lets you talk about irregular properties of larger bits of structure in a way. That's what was on this last slide, right? So I don't know, things about, like kick the bucket. You can build kick the bucket and save the tree with because that idea, like the idea would be whatever those irregular things are, they should always fit into a single workspace. Because then you can build up the workspace and you can just save it. So when it's time to produce a sentence, you don't necessarily have to build up everything from the bottom. You just have to find appropriate things to stitch together to say the thing that you want. So most of the actual production of a sentence is just grabbing preformed workspaces and putting them together in an appropriate way. The job of building up those workspaces, that's something that can be done offline. You do that in acquisition or whatever. You can always build new ones. It's always possible to build new structures. But for something that you use constantly, you don't have to redo it every single time. That's a sort of, that's very conceptual. I don't have any way to make arguments for that at this point, but like, it's an interesting thought.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very well put. Any other questions, anyone? I think everybody's trying to process what they've just listened to.
Yeah, I apologize. It's a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
But you had a very short time. Again, I think totally saved it, seriously. Because it's a very long detail.
May I
Yes, please.
something?
Yes,
Thank you, Thomas. Does your theory recommends working memory for the working memory? As it's lessen the memory load, the different working spaces. I see it's different from merge, and you propose some stitching overlapping with different working spaces.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, does it proper for the memory load? Does it increase the memory load?
That's a really good question. And I'm not actually sure. I can see it kind of going either way. So like one of the conceptual arguments for something like phase theory was to reduce the need for working memory. You only have to have one phase plus a little bit in working memory at any given time as you're building up a structure. And with my story, you potentially will want to have multiple ones sort of floating around. If you're building several different workspaces independently, you kind of have to have all of them available in parallel. So you could imagine that my story is a bit worse for that. But I think actually it's probably a wash, but like, so if you think in terms of standard phase theory, at any given time, you're doing merge on one chunk of structure. But if you're creating a really long sentence, you send something off to spell out, you still have to have that somewhere that you can grab it again at the end in order to pronounce and interpret the sentence. So it's maybe in like not in the most immediate bit of working memory, but like a register close by so that you can grab. So that and I think in my story that's actually not any different. You can build up, you're building up the workspaces. In principle, you're building them up in parallel, but at any given time, you're only building up one of them. The other ones are floating around and ready to be grabbed to put together at the end. You need to have multiple ones accessible for the stitching operation, but I don't think that ends up with a big difference from standard phase theory. The one thing where I think maybe I have an advantage is the last thing that I was saying, that this theory makes it more plausible that you can have non-trivial bits of structure associated with sound and meaning that you store, so that you don't actually have to build all of the individual phases for every sentence you use. Like once you build the structure for kick the bucket, or even for like, the transitive use of drink, once you've built that structure, you don't have to actually build it again. You could just save that in the lexicon. And so when it's time to produce the sentence, the only thing you need to do is grab it's kind of like it ends up being sort of like very approximately one phase per word. I mean, words are ill-defined, but something like a word corresponds to a phase. So what you have to do, your lexicon has a pre-built phase for each word. And then you just grab the words you need, and you have to stitch them together, but you don't have to do the full syntactic computation to build up the phase for each of those individual words. So maybe that actually simplifies working memory access. I don't know much about processing. I have no expertise in that area. So all of this is very speculative, but I think it's a really interesting thing to think about. Yeah. Thank you. I like that.
Thank you. Another one, are you offering some criteria for identifying the phases, or other than offering new one, are you accepting the standard existing criteria for the phases?
That's another really good question.
Domains.
Yeah, no, that's another really good question. The basics of the theory don't make any predictions or requirements about what counts as a phase. It's compatible with anything being a phase. So the theory can work with the standard set of phase heads, and that's what I've done just for demonstration purposes. It's easiest to do it that way. It's compatible with something completely different. That means that it doesn't make any strong predictions about what things should count as phases. The only thing, what it does, I mean, it makes the basic prediction that like things that show opacity effects have to be phases, and things that don't show opacity effects should not be phases. But that's no different from standard. That's just the basic idea, right? So like it's not easy to use that to come up with a simple diagnostic. So yeah, but it is, I mean, standard phase theory also, the basic ideas of standard phase theory are completely compatible with having a different set of phase heads. So the phase heads that you choose, little v, c, etc., like that keeps changing. People change that depending on what they're working on. So in that sense, this is not really a change from that. But yeah, I think in principle it allows a little bit more flexibility, because there's not the idea that a particular head tells you now it's time to do spell out. Instead, you just build up until you decide to stop building up.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for the really good presentation.
Thank you.
It's the first time that I hear something about phase theory. I heard something other than Murat Özgen. That's our pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Esra, for your question. Any other questions? Okay, I'm assuming there aren't any other questions. Dear Murat, do you have one more question?
No.
Okay. Thank you very much, Thomas, for this presentation. Seriously, the subject was very intriguing. We're still absorbing all the information in. Thank you very much. Thank you for accepting our invitation and taking your time out to spend with us. Seriously, it was a pleasure for all of us. Is there anything you would like to add before we end this evening?
No, I see. Okay, I see. Murat has put the Dobashi reference in the chat. Thank you. That's that.
Yeah.
I meant to ask for that because I've been looking for other people who are worried about this problem. So that's very useful. Yeah, no, thank you. Thanks everyone for coming, and thanks for the excellent questions. And again, thanks for the invitation. This was a lot of fun.
It was a fun for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Then thanks for everyone who's attended today, and thank you for all those who will be watching on our YouTube channel. I hope you guys have enjoyed tonight. Thank you very much, and have a great evening and afternoon for you, Thomas. I think it's evening for us, but still morning there.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Have a great evening and morning, everyone. Bye bye.
Thanks
Thank you.
everyone. Bye.
Have a great day.
Have a
Bye.
great day.